everybody, and welcome back to New Books in History. I'm Marshall Poe, your host. Each week we pick a new history book that we find particularly interesting, and we interview the author of that book. This week we're very pleased to have Joel Lewis on the show, and we'll be talking about his illuminating new book, Youth Against Fascism, Young Communists in Britain and the United States, 1919 to 1939. You've probably heard of appeasement. You know, the Spanish Civil War, the Nazi Anschluss, Neville Chamberlain, peace in our time, that kind of thing. It was a moment in which the Western democracies, or the leadership of the Western democracies, sort of fell down on the job. They didn't take fascism and Nazism as seriously as they should have, and in particular, they did not believe what Adolf Hitler was pretty plainly telling them. For this, they are rightly castigated. But everyone wasn't fooled, as Joel points out in this book. Communist and socialist organizations were, so to say, on top of fascism very early and recognized it for the threat that it was. And one of the things that they did was they mobilized youth groups to fight against fascism. Joel tells the fascinating tale of this effort on the part of the international communist and socialist movement to try to make the Western democracies aware of the dire threat that fascism posed to them. They ultimately did not succeed, which is unfortunate, but nonetheless, they should receive credit for what they did, and Joel gives it to them in this fascinating book. I enjoyed talking to him today, and I hope that you enjoy the interview. It'll be coming up in a second. But before I present it to you, I would like to ask a favor. New Books in History is supported by the Department of History at the University of Iowa. They employ me, and also by publishers all over the world who send me books. And these two patrons, so to say, like to know that the show is being listened to. So I'd like to ask you, if you are on Facebook, if you could become a friend of New Books in History. All you do is go to Facebook and search for New Books in History, and then become a friend of the show. And that way I can show both the people here at the university and the publishers who send me these books that there are a lot of people interested in this show, and they should continue to support it. So anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And here's the interview with Joel Lewis. Hi, Joel.
Hey, Marshall. How you doing today?
I'm very well. Where are you exactly? You're in Michigan, is that correct?
Yep. I'm at Saginaw Valley State University in Michigan here.
That's
it's over in the Tri-City area, Saginaw and Flint.
I used to live in Ann Arbor. I told your friend Robert, actually, and colleague, who suggested that I have you on the show, thank you, Robert, that I actually miss Michigan quite a bit this time of year because of the fruit that you guys have.
Oh, the fruit here is amazing.
You have this is like a secret. People in America don't know this, but when I lived in Michigan, every spring and summer, there was just incredible bounty of wonderful fruit. We don't get that in Iowa.
Yeah.
We have corn, and it's not even designed for humans to eat. So anyway, I should tell our listeners we have Joel Lewis on the show today, and we will be talking about his book, Youth Against Fascism, Young Communists in Britain and the United States, 1919 to 1939. As I've told Joel, this is a topic that fascinates me primarily because in the circles that I began to run in my 20s and 30s, I would occasionally run into red diaper babies. And I'd grown up in Kansas, and we didn't have any of them there, but I met some of them on the East and West Coast, and I always kind of wondered, what environs they had grown up in, and really, Joel does a terrific job of talking about their parents' generation, really, and kind of how they attempted to negotiate communism in two very inhospitable places for communism, that is Britain and the United States. So it's a terrific book. I really enjoyed it, and I suggest anybody who's interested in this topic should go out and read it. But Joel, let me ask you to begin with to tell us a little bit about yourself. That is, where you grew up and where you went to school and that kind of thing.
Well, off the bat here, thank you so much for your kind words. I'm not sure if this manuscript necessarily deserves as kind of words.
I liked it a lot. I guess we're always
our own worst critics here. I'm actually, it's sort of neat here, teaching at Saginaw Valley State University. I was originally born in Flint, Michigan, and grew up here in the central Michigan area. Grew up in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, where I went to CMU all the way from undergrad through PhD. So it's neat having a chance here to still be in this area and still teach in this area, having grown up here.
Yeah, they must love you there at CMU. That's Central Michigan University, for those of you who don't know. Yeah. And so how did you become interested in history?
It's actually it's a long and bizarre story, but
do tell.
To get to the chase of it here, my mother was a high school history teacher, and if anyone had told me when I was growing up that I'd be a historian someday, I just would have laughed at them. when I went to university, I was planning on being a double major in theater and music, and somehow ended up not there. It was quite funny, actually. I initially hadn't planned on going to university at all. I had planned on most working class kids who don't know about scholarships and financial aid. I had planned on going into the military. I lucked out right before I was about to sign up for the Air Force. Central Michigan offered me a full ride academic scholarship.
That's great.
Yep, I was all ready to sign the papers with the recruiter, so got bailed out on that. And no, it's been a long and fascinating trip for me. The main thing that got me interested in history was actually my own love of music, my own love of folk music. For years, I had been a huge fan of folk music and had always said that I didn't like history until my mom pointed out to me one day that folk music is really oral history and that I just didn't necessarily like reading the textbooks. So that was what convinced me to become interested in history. But my main thing that switched me over to be a history major was when I was 19. I took a course on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust at Central Michigan University, and I've been hooked on studying themes of fascism and anti-fascism ever since.
That's interesting. You mentioned folk music. I promised I wouldn't do this and mention all these specific names, but you know who Alan Lomax is?
Oh, yes, indeed.
He just died recently, didn't he? Just the other day, I think. Yeah. Oh, for those of you who follow kind of folk music and that sort of thing, I know that I was a fan of Alan Lomax back in the day. So yeah, I believe he just passed. I could be totally wrong about that. I don't know why I'm saying that, but I believe that's true. So then, who did you work with in graduate school? Who was your advisor?
My main advisor in graduate school, I had two main advisors. One was Jim Schmeeken, who has got to be the most kind and warm and welcoming man I've ever gotten a chance to work with. Absolutely great individual.
That was my undergraduate advisor. No, go ahead.
No, Jim's main interest was in British urban and labor history, and my other advisor was Eric Johnson, who specialized in Nazi Germany, in particular, trying to look at aspects of Nazi terror. So by combining those two together as advisors, this is the final project that ended up coming out. Was interested in British history, interested in things with fascism, and somehow ended up doing this book in the end.
This is something of an unusual topic. I mean, it's not as if the Young Communist League, under its various titles, is something very many people know about. How did you learn about it to begin with?
It was actually just dumb luck, me stumbling across anything with the Young Communist League. My initial PhD research had absolutely nothing to do with the YCL. I'd actually gone on a research trip over to Glasgow, Scotland. My initial topic for my PhD dissertation was supposed to be on folk music during the Popular Front era, and I was sitting in the archive reading through some stuff on folk music one day, and this wonderful archivist came out named Audrey Canning, and she brought an unpublished manuscript about the British Young Communist League and said, there's some stuff about folk music in there. Why don't you take a peek? And I sat there all afternoon and read this dissertation by Mike Waite and became absolutely fascinated with the Young Communists, and have been trying to write their story ever since.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is a very compelling story. I should tell people that, because these people struggled against extraordinarily long odds, and they had the benefit of being totally right about fascism. So, as I say in my write-up for the interview, we should give credit where credit is due. And, there was a thing, appeasement, but they didn't do it. So they certainly deserve credit for that. So why don't we launch into a discussion of the book itself then? Tell me about the origins of the, let's just call it the Young Communist League, because it has various names throughout. So tell me about the origins of the Young Communist League in Britain and the United States.
Well, really the origins of the movement in general internationally has to do with the Socialist Youth International prior to World War I. One of the unique things about the youth movement, something I've tried to keep in perspective of looking at these multiple generations, really has to do with the key themes of peace and war. One of the unique things about the Socialist Youth International in Europe prior to the war and during World War I is that they are the main organization in the Second International, the 1915, that comes out completely en masse against the war, and starting to form a very early relationship with the Bolshevik movement through some of the peace initiatives going on in 1915. And in terms of when the Communist International was founded after the Russian Revolution, the Socialist Youth International is the only group left over from the Second International that switches completely over to embracing communism. So I thought that was a unique aspect about the youth. Most of what happened with adult movements, both in the United States and Europe, was extreme factionalism and splits within the socialist movement. But you had the entire youth movement embracing communism in 1919 officially. So I thought it was quite a compelling story, not only looking at how young people reacted against World War I, but also seeing World War II looming on the horizon, how they shaped their politics still around issues of war and peace.
Just to take one step back, my impression is, not being an expert on it, is that World War I really broke the left apart, in the sense that one thing that I do remember is that the German Social Democratic Party, the SPD, voted for Germany to enter the war, or voted to fund the war, and this caused a split within the European socialist movement. Am I remembering that right?
Very much so. There was only one member of the SPD who didn't support the war, and that was Karl Liebknecht, who was actually the official head of the Socialist Youth International, and that's one of the reasons why the Socialist Youth really stuck to the anti-war platform early on. Had a lot to do with the leadership of Karl Liebknecht, both before and after the war.
And then he founds the KPD, the KPD, the German Communist Party. Yeah, that's exactly. Yes, I remember this well. So then, in 1917, when the Bolsheviks take power in Russia, they found, I happen to know this, they found the Komsomol, which is the Young Communist League in Russia. What is the initial relationship between the Komsomol and the Young Communist League? Because I did some searching around the web, and what people seem to say that the Young Communist League was patterned on, or even modeled on the Komsomol. Is that true?
It's true to a certain extent, yes and no. I mean, if you look at the first couple years of the Communist International, especially with the founding of the Young Communist International, the first couple years of the movement are really a period of chaos and flux in the first period. Much of what's going on, particularly if you look at Western parties, both in the United States and in Great Britain, of the young communist movements, is they perceive that they're modeling themselves after the Soviet Komsomol, but not really having a full understanding of exactly what the role is that the Komsomol is playing. Much of what the youth are trying to do in both the United States and Britain is really trying to play what I would call a vanguard role early on, perceiving of themselves as the real revolutionary vanguard of international communism, and being the youth trying to lead the adults in terms of new politics. And it's a real problem the first couple of years of trying to understand exactly what's going on with the communist movement in the Soviet Union, in particular trying to understand exactly what this new Communist International entails. There's a number of people that I think early on that are supporting this that don't have a full conception of exactly what they're getting themselves into in terms of the organizational structure.
And is it the case then that was it the case after the formation of the Comintern? This is in 1917, 1918, which is kind of the Third International, I guess. I don't really remember. Yes. Was it the case that the Communist Party of the United States and of Britain, I guess there was some factionalism, but let's just speak of them as whole entities, were they under the command or direction of the Russian Communist Party?
Once again, it's a pretty complex story there. I would say yes and no all at the same time. I'm part of the problem of trying to understand, particularly the relationship with Western parties. Oftentimes when people try and study the relationship with the Comintern, they assume that since the Comintern made a dictate, that this dictate came straight down and that people followed it to its complete letter and word. In terms of communication and actually being able to enforce their dictates, there's a lot of debates early on. There's a lot of different directives coming from Moscow that people are supposed to be following in the West, that they're not completely following. It's really not until the mid 1920s that you can see Moscow now starting to have a full grip on the Communist International, and parties in the West now having a full understanding of exactly what this relationship with Moscow has to be in terms of following the leadership of the Comintern on all points.
I see. So you call this early period from roughly 1917 to I guess 20 something. The Leninist generation.
Right.
How does that distinguish it from earlier or later generations?
Well, much of what I'm trying to do with this book, besides showing a comparative analysis of youth movements in the U.S. and Britain, is trying to also show a comparison between what I've termed the Leninist generation of 1919 to 1933 versus what I call the Popular Front generation of 1933 to 1945. What's really different about these two generations, particularly if you look at the issue of youth, both of these generations framed their entire worldview based upon issues of war and based upon issues of peace. The real nitty-gritty issues that are going to impact young people. But what's interesting about them is that propaganda is completely different, and their tactics end up becoming completely different. The Leninist generation frames its entire worldview based around the experience of World War I and what they perceived the Russian Revolution was going to bring. They argued that if you brought an end to capitalism internationally, that this would bring an end to imperialism and would bring an end to modern warfare. And therefore, revolution had to be central on the table for all aspects of the politics of the Leninist generation. What switches significantly in 1933 is once you have Adolf Hitler becoming securely in power, is communists recognizing that it's not the market economy that's going to cause another world war, it's going to be Nazi fascism. So it's interesting to see how these young people react. Instead of denouncing Western democracies and calling for their overthrow, they start calling for the protection of Western democracies. They start calling for international collective security pacts, a completely different concept of world politics, but still framed within the venue of war and peace.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Let's come to the Popular Front in just a moment. I want to ask some basic questions about the Young Communist League in the 1920s. How large was it in the United States and in Britain?
In Britain, at peak periods, you're talking about around 5,000 people, particularly during the periods of the general strike, some of the general strikes going on in 24, 25, and 26. In the United States, it's really difficult to tell. I mean, one of the problems in putting this piece together, and part of the reason why I focus specifically on propaganda analysis, is the source materials that are available when you're trying to compare the British movement with the American movement. All of the archives and documents for the British movement are very open. They're very accessible. They're well organized. During the period of the Cold War, a number of American documents were either A, destroyed, or B, sent off to Moscow for safekeeping to keep people from being prosecuted during the Cold War. And many of those documents, they've been becoming more accessible since the 90s, but still very different. It's in many ways a sort of comparing apples and oranges here. It's difficult to really get to the key points here of what the numbers are when we talk about the movements. In all honesty, I couldn't even give you a ballpark guess on specifically how many youth were dealing with the American movement. They kept their numbers, kept much of the information quite secretive.
Now, but it was mostly, it was concentrated on the East Coast and primarily in New York, wasn't it?
Oh, very much so, very much so. It's a movement of... if you want to talk about the real centers, what you're talking about here is places like New York, Chicago, and Detroit.
I see.
Really having the main brunt here of the youth movement.
I see. So was it... now, you could kind of be arrested in the 1920s for being a communist in the United States, if I recall correctly. Usually it was under the pretext of being a foreigner, having foreign sympathies or something. I can't remember, was it the Dawes raids, or what was the name of them?
Yeah, with the Palmer raids.
Palmer raids, yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's exactly right. So maybe you could... Was the Young Communist League an above-ground organization in the 1920s, or was it illegal, or...?
It's... Initially, right before the Palmer raids, you have the first creation of the Young Communist League in the United States. Technically, at that point, they're an above-ground legal organization. What happens after the Palmer raids is you have the YCL being restructured now as a clandestine underground organization, but also having a front of a legal organization, what they call the Young Workers League. The Young Workers League in terms of its propaganda, in terms of the way it structured itself, is it tried to sort of weave itself through the legal loopholes in terms of persecution of communists. But throughout the 1920s, you also did have an underground movement attached with that. The Young Communist League throughout the 20s technically was an underground movement, while the Young Workers League was its legal front in the United States.
I see. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what I was in the Cub Scouts when I was young, and I got kicked out, actually, because I was not very well behaved. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what being a member of the Young Workers League or the Young Communist League meant for somebody in the 1920s and early 30s. What did they do?
Well, really, in the 1920s, much of what it's about, particularly for the fact that it's based around areas in New York City, the primary composition of both the American Communist Party and the Young Communist Movement in the 20s is primarily immigrant groups. In many ways, it became cultural extensions of culture that happened back in Europe and a way of keeping some of these immigrant groups together in terms of their own political identity. Much of what went on during the 20s, though, is mainly focused on battling aspects about racism, dealing with key issues in terms of labor unions, but also in many ways, there's some real interesting periods towards the end of the 20s where you get young communists trying to organize in the American South, trying to work with farm labor. But it's very much a movement based around the concepts of rooting oneself completely in the politics of labor and trying to essentially restructure labor politics into revolutionary initiatives. Much of what the communists are doing during the 1920s is essentially trying to infiltrate different organizations and trying to win them over to a revolutionary position.
I see. So did they have camps and seminars and reading groups and that sort of thing?
There are a couple of camps I know that existed in areas of northern New York. The infamous Camp Wichita, where Pete Seeger used to go.
Oh, is that right?
Used to go play all the time. It's really during the 1930s that you get more of the cultural initiatives going on in terms of the youth. During this period, much of what the socialist youth are trying to focus on in the 1920s is more cultural initiatives. The young communists, in many ways, are rejecting the cultural programs of the 1920s, saying that the real key to revolution was to focus specifically on labor organizing and revolutionary initiatives. We'll see that completely change, though, during the Popular Front. During the Popular Front, we'll see young communists trying to embrace cultural initiatives, embracing things such as camps and recreation for young people.
Yeah, let's actually go ahead and talk about the Popular Front. This Popular Front was, I think most people forget this or just don't know about it. It was kind of a bombshell for the left because it initiated a policy which was almost entirely contrary to the one that they had been pursuing during the Leninist generation, as you will call it. I like that. So explain to us what the Popular Front was.
It's funny. In many ways, it seems that historians have had a bit of an amnesia when it comes to the Popular Front, and in many ways have forgotten to really talk about this period. Which is a bit ironic, and one of the reasons why, if you think of the politics of the Cold War, is it's really Popular Front structures that are utilized right after World War II to essentially create communist dictatorships in Eastern Europe. So many people discredited the Popular Front after that. But what you see happening almost immediately after the rise of Hitler, really what helped to bring Hitler to power was the fact that all anti-fascist parties in Germany at the time didn't get along. They saw the danger of Adolf Hitler, but they also saw danger in each other. For the fact that they hadn't collaborated, this is one of the things that helped bring Hitler into power, even with a minority vote. Hypothetically, had the Socialist Party and Communist Party collaborated together, along with, say, the Catholic Center Party in Germany, Hitler's rise to power could have been blocked through a democratic process. So what we're seeing communists starting to identify in the period from 33 into 35 is that the only way, not only is the only way to block fascism domestically is through some type of unity, but that the only way to prevent Hitler from bringing about a world war is essentially to bring about international unity once again. In many ways, trying to recreate the old World War I alliances that existed against Germany. Threaten Hitler with a nightmare war with enemies on all sides, and the argument being that this is a war that he would be crazy to actually start because it's a war they'd be guaranteed to lose if you could create firm international alliances. But it's interesting. Essentially, what I tried to look at here is how the Communist International came to redefine what fascism was. Prior to the adoption of the Popular Front, pretty much any movement that was anti-communist, the Comintern would declare to be fascist. So they had a real misconception during the 1920s of exactly what fascism entailed. By redefining fascism here in 1935, what they're really helping to do is helping young people to completely restructure their politics, not based now around revolution, but based around anti-fascism. But the rhetoric that they use to justify this is many ways much of the same rhetoric that had been used to justify the Leninist generation, embracing issues of war and peace that really impact young people. So it's an incredibly complex time, but incredibly fascinating, and it's something that's oftentimes forgotten. One of the reasons being is if you studies that look completely at adult movements, they point out something completely correct, is that you have the same people in 1929 calling for international revolution in the adult movements, now calling for peace and democracy in 1935. And a lot of people saying, well, that's complete insincere lying. You're just simply saying that because Moscow has told you to. If you look at young people and think about young people coming in as new recruits during the 1930s, these aren't the kids left over from the 1920s. This is a whole new, brand new generation. They're embracing communism not because of revolutionary initiatives, but because almost completely based around the values of anti-fascism. So I think there's a real deeper sincerity when it comes to the youth movement, when it comes to the Popular Front.
So would you say in general that the communist parties and the socialist parties were able to use anti-fascism as a recruitment tool?
Oh, yes, most definitely. It really becomes the central feature of both communist politics and socialist politics during the 1930s. The reason why you get the if you look at the American context, why you get the Pete Seegers and the Woody Guthries coming into the party isn't that they're calling for proletarian revolution. It's because they're calling for anti-fascist movement. So it becomes a main recruiting tool for both movements. And it's a bizarre situation that happens between the socialists and the communists, because what we'll see the socialists starting to do is becoming far more radical in revolutionary politics, and the communists becoming extremely conservative when it comes to revolutionary politics, essentially switching sides on the far left.
Yeah, one of the other things you point out that I thought was interesting is that it seems as if the 1930s was an era in which the socialists and the communists sort of got religion on the problem of recruiting and building a base, because another thing that they rethink is nationalism.
Oh, very much so.
So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
It's interesting to think about communists trying to restructure themselves.
Rebrand themselves. Yeah, no, well, they did. That's what they did.
Right,
you know?
Right. It's quite interesting, particularly when it comes to the youth movement. What we'll see communists starting to argue is that the main way that fascists had come to power was by manipulating people's emotions when it came to the issue of nationalism. Fascists arguing that they were the party protecting the interests of the nation. What the communists begin to argue then is that the only way to block fascism is for communists to also embrace nationalism, to define themselves as the true patriots of the nation, and identifying the fascists as essentially enemies of the nation. So you get some real bizarre twists and turns, especially in the American movement. By the year 1936, if you're looking at some of the American publications, you almost never see images of Lenin anymore. Lenin has now been replaced by Abraham Lincoln. And talking about Lincoln as the great hero of American communists, it's a bizarre situation going on here, but completely intriguing.
So let's talk a little bit about this is something I'm interested in again, the kind of the cultural initiatives in the 1930s. How did the communists attempt to recruit and engage young people? And again, I'm talking about what sort of day-to-day activities did they involve them in?
Much of what's going on here is particularly trying to start utilizing more aspects of popular culture when it comes to jazz, when it comes to swing. particularly for the fact that the Nazis had denounced such things as jazz and swing music. We see the communists essentially trying to pick these up and saying, well, if the fascists hate this stuff, well, this is the stuff we're going to embrace. This is what young people want. What they start doing is describing fascism as a reaction against modernism and saying that what young communists need to do is embrace all aspects of modern youth culture. So you start having young communists throwing jazz concerts, throwing swing concerts, using these as fundraisers to help with the Spanish Civil War. If you look at their publications, you start getting cosmetic tips for young women. During the midst of international crisis, you're getting makeup tips in young communist publications because they argue that this is what being a modern young woman is all about, and this is how communists need to identify themselves. But particularly things such as folk music as well. I mean, what really got me interested in looking at the 1930s and even starting to look at communists is my deep love for the folk music of the 1930s. And it's at this point that you start having folk music also becoming a dominant part of young communist culture. The real heroes being people like Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, Paul Robeson, all of these great American singers becoming the sort of forefront of the communist movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a kind of a general tendency to forget that all of these people were socialists.
Right.
That I don't know. We shape the past in ways that make us comfortable in the present, and it's not comfortable to think of Pete Seeger as a socialist. But
oh god, yeah. Especially, I remember, in kindergarten learning to sing the song "This land is your land, this land is my land." I played that in my introductory history courses all the time when I start talking about socialism and communism in the 20th century. I was like, you kids don't even realize it, but you're raised on a socialist song here. I'm like, it was an important part of the story of the 1930s with the New Deal coalitions in the United States. When you look at Great Britain, some of the coalitions that came together in trying to reframe the politics of the national government, young communists in Great Britain, ironically, starting to embrace Winston Churchill during the 1930s, somebody they'd always identified as one of the greatest enemies of the communist movement, but somebody who they now saw as an important anti-fascist.
And a great internationalist. People forget that about Churchill, too, that he loved international organizations.
Well, that's going to be one of we'll talk about this later on, but one of the great struggles I'm going to have here when it comes to writing the second volume of this book is we see young communists in Britain throughout the 30s saying that if you got rid of Neville Chamberlain and you put Winston Churchill in charge, that they would support then such as British entry into World War II and declaring war on Nazi Germany. It's a real problem then for the summer of 1940 once Winston Churchill does become the British Prime Minister and the Soviet Union's still not in the war and Moscow is still saying not to support the war. It's a bizarre story of twists and turns there. It becomes very awkward.
It's interesting. So, well, let me ask this then. Did it work? That is, we said that the communist movement in both Britain and the United States rebrands itself and rolls out a kind of new strategy to recruit people, and it's built on anti-fascism on the one hand and nationalism of a sort, national pride on the other. Do you see a marked increase in the number of people participating in communist activities or joining the Communist Party in the 1930s?
Oh yeah, most definitely. I mean, the communists had some real boosts in numbers once the Great Depression started taking hold, but really it's once they switch over to the Popular Front and anti-fascism that the numbers of the movements in both Britain and the United States really start increasing dramatically. What I would say in terms of their success, though, is not so much – I wouldn't measure their success by the growth of their own movements, but by the relationships and bonds they started forming with other movements. By the end of the 1930s, if you look at the British example, you have the British Young Communist League holding meetings with British Boy Scouts and the YMCA.
Really?
And the Junior Imperial League is also invited to these meetings. They have nothing else in common outside of the fact that they're young people concerned about fascism and World War II. And I think that's really what I'm trying to argue here is that, we have this great nostalgia about the 1930s and 1940s where we talk about the quote-unquote greatest generation. What the movement that really starts bringing together the greatest generation, I would argue, is really rooted in the American and British communist movement. That these young people really start pushing issues of youth unity and trying to get American and British youth solidly behind positions of anti-fascism. And that, I think that's part of the story that's been completely written out.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right about that. I mean, I'm teaching this period right now in a Western Civ class I teach, and I do try to emphasize that, again, I've said this before, but, you know, the communists and socialists were certainly right about fascism well before anybody else.
Yeah.
And they definitely deserve credit for that fact. And there is a kind of tendency to forget that in our kind of blanket condemnations of the communists for most of the ills of the 20th century.
Yeah.
We do that, and I guess I've even been guilty of that myself. So why do you think that they were ahead of the curve on this issue? Why did the communists sense what many other parties did not?
I mean, something we need to keep in mind when we think about the rise of the Nazi Party or even the Fascist Party in Italy, the one thing that communists and socialists understood very well was exactly who fascists perceived of as their main opponents. You know, when the concentration camps are first opened in Nazi Germany, it's not for Jews, it's for communists. This is, these are the first people rounded up and targeted by the Nazi regime. You know, one of the quotes I love to use in my class while I'm explaining fascism, there's the old quote from Mussolini, where Mussolini says, "The socialists ask, what is our program? Our program is to smash the skulls of the socialists." I think it puts a pretty easy black and white worldview of understanding exactly what fascism is threatening here. I think for the fact that the communists were the first ones targeted with the rise of Nazi Germany made them far more adept to understanding the nature of this movement and understanding what was needed to try and bring this movement down.
I see. How did the relationship between the Soviet Communist Party and the Western Communist Party, and particularly their youth movements, develop during the 1930s?
Well, it's interesting. If you look, the very final meeting of the Communist International is in 1935. Stalin's going to have this organization dissolved in 1943. At the final meeting there of the youth movement with the Communist International, young communists are told in very specific language by the leadership that things have changed, times have changed, and the Western parties, according to the propaganda with the youth movements, were supposed to be completely independent and reliant on their own resources. How that worked out in reality is a very different story. But if you look at simply the rhetoric of the propaganda, what young communists start to argue in 1935 is that they now have a completely independent relationship from Moscow, have their own independent structures, and ironically, you also start getting the American Young Communist League being praised as the greatest leaders of the youth movement throughout the world instead of the Soviet Young Communist League. It's a bizarre situation where now the United States is in the vanguard role of the international movement instead of the Soviets. It's a real interesting period, but in terms of what's going on in reality behind the scenes, it's a very different story. But the way young people are having the story presented to them through the propaganda is that Western movements are completely independent at this point. In reality, they're not, of course, but this is what's being told to young people. It's part of the reason why I think they're joining in greater numbers.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about a fellow that I find fascinating, and that is Georgy Dmitriev. And he's a very interesting fellow, and he played an important role in all of this.
Oh, very much so. Dimitrov, it's really quite sad in terms of the history of Dimitrov, because Dimitrov simply gets written off because of his relationship with Stalin and his relationship with the Soviet regime, and for the fact that he becomes leader of communist Bulgaria after World War II. The importance of Dimitrov in the 1930s, though, is absolutely pivotal and vital. What his real claim to fame is in 1933, is when the Reichstag fire happens in Berlin, and you have the Reichstag fire trials afterwards. Georgy Dimitrov is one of the people put on trial, and this man refuses legal representation, decides to represent himself. He ended up winning the case, and the Nazis dropped all charges because every time they put Dimitrov up on up to talk about what was going on, is instead of accepting the notion that the communists had started the Reichstag fire and say, according to the evidence we have, the Nazis started the Reichstag fire themselves. You people are enemies to the German nation and need to be called out on this. We see the Nazis then dropping all charges and allowing Dimitrov to get out of prison, but he comes to Moscow and he spends the next 2 years meeting with Stalin, trying to convince Stalin that things have to change. We have to drop this revolutionary stuff, and that the main enemy and danger here has got to be identified clearly as Nazi fascism. Mm-hmm. That Nazi fascism is what's going to bring about World War II, which threatens the destruction of the Soviet Union, threatens the destruction of Western democracies, threatens the destruction of Jews throughout Europe. It's another thing to keep in mind. The communists also kept issues about anti-Semitism at the forefront, warning about the potential dangers of something like the Holocaust occurring. And it's part of their worldview in the 1930s is trying to prevent both World War II and the Holocaust, but at the same time trying to bring down Hitler's regime without war. But Dimitrov is really the man that helps to completely redefine the Communist International and helps to start building these alliances throughout the world in terms of trying to build up the Grand Alliance internationally, but also domestically trying to encourage young communists to become leaders in their nation when it comes to anti-fascist politics instead of simply revolutionaries on the outskirts of politics. Yeah,
he is a tragic figure in a certain way because he does get evaluated in the light of what happened in the late in the war and after the war when he becomes basically the dictator of Bulgaria. But prior to that, in the 30s, he was really kind of a heroic figure. He was right where others were wrong. Any association with Stalin is bound to taint you. So he had no
rightfully so.
Yeah, he's not going to win. He's not going to win that battle. But he was kind of a tragic figure in that way, as he spent all of the 30s, as far as I can tell, warning people about Hitler. And people didn't take him terribly seriously, including Stalin, I think, even though he did support these anti-fascist policies. Maybe you could talk a little bit now about how the Young Communist League reacted to the various spates of Nazi aggression in the 1930s. That is the taking of the Rhineland and then the Anschluss and then the Sudeten Crisis and that kind of thing.
Right. Well, really the central point for Young Communists they're very much concerned about some of the expansion going on in the East, of course, because that means that the Nazis are going towards the Soviet Union. They're very much concerned with that. But really what's framing their worldview is not the centrality of Eastern Europe, but is the Spanish Civil War. And it really comes down, it's quite interesting to read the way Young Communists talk about the Spanish Civil War, the ways they support it. One of the main things that they argue is Spain, and unfortunately, hindsight's always 20/20, and I think in many ways they're correct on this, is they state that if you get young people from throughout the world to come to Spain to not only take on Franco, but taking on the Nazis and the Italian fascists there in Spain, that you can destroy fascism there through some type of united movement. That essentially, if you defeat these powers in Spain, it would destroy German war morale, would destroy Italian war morale, and the Germans and Italians would throw these guys out by themselves and would prevent World War II from happening. But the key is you have to defeat them in Spain, and you have to keep their armies bogged down in Spain. If you want to start talking about places like the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, if you look at the timeline on this, as soon as Neville Chamberlain in February of 1939 recognizes Franco's government as legitimate government, what the Germans do is they immediately pull their troops out, send them over to the east, and within a week invade Czechoslovakia. Had somebody like Neville Chamberlain not recognized Franco's regime and had the international community supported Spain, those German troops would have continued bogged down in Spain and couldn't start the war in the east. And it's important to keep that in mind. And young people who came to Spain, young people from throughout the world who didn't necessarily have any affiliation with communism came to Spain because they saw Spain not only as the key to defeat fascism, but to prevent World War II. They argue if you take on fascism here, the World War II can be prevented. We're talking about over 50 million lives that are going to be lost in World War II. And that's part of the story that completely gets written out here, is the centrality of Spain to all young people throughout the world.
Mm-hmm. Are there any, this is a kind of surprise question, you don't have to answer if you don't want, I just am interested. Are there any kind of famous figures that were in the Young Communist League that we would recognize today who went to Spain or who fought in Spain or who, is there anybody, any name we could recognize? Or if you don't know, you don't know.
Not any names. I mean, one of the great tragedies for volunteers who go to Spain, number one, most of these young people aren't going to come back home.
Yeah,
I mean, the experience of being part of the international brigades was absolutely brutal. A lot of these young people aren't going to come home. Number two, when they come home to places like the United States, for the fact that they've interacted with communists, is they now become targets of federal investigations and harassed, what we dub the quote-unquote premature anti-fascists. It's great to be an anti-fascist in 1941, but if you're an anti-fascist in Barcelona in 38, well, it means that you're a communist and a danger. So, I guess a couple of prominent figures in terms of the culture of the Spanish Civil War, once again, to come back to some of the music stuff, Paul Robeson. One of the things that Paul Robeson does, he starts traveling around the world, doing fundraisers for young communist leagues that are supporting money to send to Spain. He also goes out to the Spanish Civil War and starts singing to the troops out on the front lines. Somebody like Pete Seeger as well. Pete Seeger in the late 1930s is a member of the American Young Communist League and also getting involved in some of these cultural movements. So,
I see. So then let's come to the really kind of crisis point, or I suspect it was a crisis point. How does the Young Communist League react to the Molotov-Ribbontrop Pact?
I was waiting for that question.
Yeah, well, it's people, inquiring minds want to know.
Oh yes, yeah. Well, that's. There's a reason why the first volume ends off in 1939, while the second volume is going to pick up in 1939. I would say they react creatively, but quite foolishly in many ways. It becomes obvious to most people in the West, especially when it comes to the youth movements. The youth movements try to argue that they're independent from Moscow and this and that and the other. But as soon as the war is declared to be an imperialist war that, according to the Soviets, workers have absolutely no interest in, when the Moscow fingers are snapped, people in the West jump, and it's an about face. What's interesting and important about that, though, is the Young Communists are actually pretty successful in the way that they frame their rhetoric to try and justify it. If you look at the propaganda of late 39 and early 1940s, it's extremely creative how they're trying to manipulate the worldview of young people who are still involved in this movement. What they start arguing was that the goal of the Popular Front movement had always been to prevent World War II, that they were willing to go to war if it was a war in Spain to defeat fascism there, but the goal had always been to prevent World War II. What they argue, and they've got some good points on this, is that Britain and France aren't sincere about this war against Adolf Hitler, that you can't trust somebody like Neville Chamberlain to be a leader of anti-fascism, because what they argue is that Neville Chamberlain is a fascist himself in many ways, or at least a dupe of Hitler's foreign policies. And if you look at the appeasement policies of the 1930s, whether it's selling out Czechoslovakia, whether it's signing the Anglo-German Friendship Pact of 1938, Neville Chamberlain is clearly aligning himself in many ways in terms of foreign policy with Hitler, essentially thinking that he can avert World War II. And most young communists, and they have a good point with that. Can you really trust somebody like Neville Chamberlain to be leading this war? And if you look at the actual dynamics of what's going on, people joke around about the early periods of war being the quote-unquote phony war until the war actually opens up on the Western Front. But remember, the war doesn't open up on the Western Front until you get rid of Neville Chamberlain. On the same day that Winston Churchill becomes British Prime Minister is the day that the Western Front is open. And that's when it gets really complicated, where I think the story will get fascinating to try and tell how young communists justify this. But essentially what they're arguing is that, throughout the 1930s, we tried to stop fascism, we tried to prevent World War II, and that the leaders who were in power here at the beginning of World War II were people who had helped support fascism in many ways, and that they can't be trusted to lead an anti-fascist war. So I mean, much of it is Moscow lines getting brought on down here, and it really destroys a lot of the movements in the West. quite tragically, especially with the American Young Communist League. I mean, some of the connections that they had been making in 38 and 39 in terms of building up their movement were amazing. And most of these alliances are going to crumble apart at the end of 39.
So the Comintern is disbanded in sometime in the war, correct?
Yes,
1940 something, three.
It's in 1943. Once as a real, it's part of what Stalin's trying to do in abandoning the Comintern. There is trying to get the Western Allies to open up the Western Front. By this point, the Battle of Stalingrad has been won. The Red Army is on the offensive, pushing the Nazis out of Soviet territory. This is trying to buy an Allied invasion by appeasing the Allies with getting rid of the Comintern. So,
and then the Young Communist League is also disbanded in during the war, correct? At least nominally.
Yes and no. In the United States, in 1944, the Young Communist League, along with the American Communist Party, particularly after the Tehran Conference, what they do is they technically disband themselves and reform as new organizations. The American Young Communist League starts calling itself American Youth for Democracy. And the Communist Party starts calling itself the Communist Political Association. In the British context, the British Communist Party, American and British Young Communist League never disbanded during the war, and actually play a pretty important role after the war in terms of British politics. Once the Labour Party wins the landslide of 45. So.
Yeah, let's talk just a little bit, go kind of very far forward. Was this generation, the Popular Front generation, significant in later post-war developments? Did any of them become political leaders themselves?
Oh, very much so. I mean, if you look at the British movement, the main person who had been in charge of the Young Communist League during the Popular Front era was a young man by the name of John Gallen. In 1956, after Khrushchev gives this secret speech and the crimes of Stalin are revealed to the world, the movement starts falling apart. John Gallen is put in charge of the British Communist Party to try and hold this all together, to try and bring some type of reform. If you look at the American context, Gil Green, who had been head of the Young Communist League, he never becomes the leader of the American Communist Party, but during the 1980s, during the Gorbachev era, Gil Green comes out as one of the strongest voices supporting Gorbachev, trying to reform not only the Soviet system, but also trying to reform the American Communist Party. It's people like Gil Green, Pete Seeger, this old Popular Front generation of youth who come back during the 1980s and essentially try and reform Western communist movements. But also in the British context as well. It's the Popular Front generation that comes back in the 1980s during the Gorbachev era.
Yeah, I was thinking of people like, kind of the sort of famous radicals of the 50s, your Jerry Rubins and Abby Hoffmans, and were any of these people associated at all with or their parents, maybe? I mean, again, I may be asking a question which you don't know the answer to.
That's a question that I don't have an answer to yet. I'm part of what I'm hoping to do in the future is to write a larger piece talking about youth politics in the modern era, starting all the way back with the French Revolution, trying to give a history of youth politics, particularly on the left, up to the modern era. So,
Well, I was going to say it's a great project and a good transition. We've taken up a tremendous amount of your time, and we're very grateful for that. Is that going to be your next project then, or what are you working on now? Maybe you could talk about that for just a little while.
Volume number 2 is in the works. I plan this summer. I'm finishing up the manuscript here.
And what are the years for that? How long?
That's going to be 1939 to 1945. I'm going to quit dodging the bullet here and go on those nitty-gritty years of 39 to 41 when we've got the communist movement doing an about-face on a lot of the Popular Front issues and really becoming in many ways subordinate to the Soviet policy again. But I'm hoping that after that, I've got 2 different projects after that. Once I get done with this World War II piece, I want to write a larger piece about youth politics in general because I think youth politics are fascinating. But I also want to get back to my old love of folk music here. Reading about communists and fascists and writing about these people for so many years, I've enjoyed it. But it's a debate where I want to add my 2 cents and then maybe hop out of the ring. Much of what's going on with the scholarship, particularly with the American Communist movement, there's a lot of ill will and a lot of nasty feelings out there among scholars who study American communism. and a lot of people really refusing to be very collegial with each other. And it's
go ahead. Why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about that? I'm interested.
Well,
I'm not run into that myself because I don't study it. But exactly.
You know, I used to be a member of the HNet list for the study of American communism because I thought it'd be a fascinating resource. What's going on there unfortunately isn't always advancing our scholarship and our research here. What's going on there is a bunch of debates from the Cold War. It's the McCarthy era being drawn out in the 21st century in digital technology of people attacking the communists and communists on there really being in denial about most things, and still being apologists for Stalin. And it's I ended up leaving that forum. I had made one comment on there once. Had made some joke about the old 1980s movie Red Dawn.
Oh yeah, Red Dawn.
Sarcastic comment about it.
It's not a bad movie.
And I had 10 people on that list denounce me as a Stalinist for making fun of Red Dawn. And so I quit the list immediately. I said, I make a joke about a dumb Patrick Swayze movie here, and you call me a Stalinist for that? I said, it's unfortunately a field of scholarship where there's a lot of great new resources coming available. To their credit, two of the more orthodox historians on this issue, John Earl Haynes and Harvey Clare, during the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Comintern archives were opened, these two men did a fantastic job of going to Moscow and getting a hold of a whole bunch of documents that people have been hoping to get a hold of for generations now in terms of scholarship. Unfortunately, what's happened with those documents since is they've used those documents essentially as smoking gun ammunition to show that the communists were involved in espionage and conspiracy and all these things, which of course is a true part of the story. But people on the left who have wanted to deny that for years and always said the smoking guns exist are being in complete denial about, are essentially entrenching themselves in old Cold War attitudes of standing up for the Soviet Union and the American left, instead of advancing a lot of the debates. Unfortunately, what's happened since the 90s with a lot of this stuff is people really entrenching themselves and not pushing the scholarship forward and really just being nasty to each other. I believe in academia it's important to have open and honest debates. I think it's okay to call people out on things when you think that they're wrong, but I think academics also need to mind their manners and be nice to each other. I don't want to write books that people are going to attack me and call me a Stalinist for writing a book saying that there was something positive about this movement in the 30s. Yeah,
no, I see what you mean. There was a little bit of that, of course, more than a little bit, I guess I would say, in my own field, which is Russian history. In the 1970s and 1980s, it's died down a little bit, although there was a spate of books which pretended to reveal things that we supposedly did not know about the Soviet Union, when in fact anybody who was paying any attention knew that we knew them.
Right.
And I think they sold a lot of copies and made certain people's academic careers, but I'm not quite sure they advance the discipline. And I'm thinking of not just the Annals of Communism series, which is pretty good, but also, the various black books of, that, I don't think they really put things in the proper perspective. I'm no supporter of Stalinist communism or any communism really, but I am a supporter of historical truth. And I think those books didn't really advance a popular understanding of what was going on in the left in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, because they are so condemnatory.
The Black Book of Communism, I mean, when that book first came out, I was actually really excited. I thought it was an interesting project. I thought it was an interesting approach to a number of things. By the time I got to the 5th page of the introduction, I mean, I read the whole thing cover to cover, but by the time I got to the 5th page, I was like, this isn't advancing our historical knowledge here. And this is playing out old Cold War debates and just being. I mean, historians, we need evidence, we need facts, and I'm not trying to say that book doesn't have evidence and facts, but we need to be honest when we have our own twists and turns on how to interpret those facts. And I guess that's my real problem with the study of communism in general. I think a lot of people have studied in the past haven't been honest about how their own perceptions of these movements influence the way they're interpreting things. I'm trying to add my 2 cents to the debate and then hop out, hoping that somebody else will take up my mantle with studying some more things with the youth. But
well, that's a really interesting point you make, and it's a tough thing to study in the sense that people can still get mileage in the press by denouncing people as socialists and communists, which is kind of remarkable because in America, at least, there really are no socialists or communists. I mean, I haven't seen any of them. I mean, I remember when I was in college, occasionally the young Spartacus would hand out leaflets, but, that was in the dark. That was in the 80s, I mean, these people are gone, but, you see people call, Obama or something a socialist, and I'm just like, well, obviously you don't have any really understanding of what real, kind of a real communist, real socialist movement is.
Well, a few months ago, every once in a while, I flip on Glenn Beck just to see how Glenn Beck is handling different things. And he was doing an interview with Sam Webb, who is currently chair of the American Communist Party. And Sam Webb started trying to talk about what's going on with the movement and different things. And all Glenn Beck did with the interview was sat there and made fun of Sam Webb. He started bringing up issues about the Nazis, saying that Nazis were socialists and that Obama's a socialist and that they're all part of the same thing, and telling Sam Webb to go back and read his history to learn that the Nazis were really socialists. And it was just ridiculous. Well, not only was it not advancing anything, but it was just historically ridiculous. Yeah.
Well, I used to work actually in journalism just a little bit. I dipped my toes in those waters just long enough to realize that it was either much too hot or much too cold for me. And I can tell you that the iron law, as Marxists might say, of journalistic popularity is that you will become popular and gain an audience if you say something idiotic and stupid or outrageous. And I think, we've seen that again and again. I mean, if someone like Glenn Beck, I don't really watch Glenn Beck, but I kind of know who he is, and or your Limbaughs or whoever, or on the left, there's a similar sort of thing, is that, saying outrageous things is really what broadcasters want you to do, so that they can sell soap on the back of it. But and I'm always wonder how these people can have any kind of intellectual. It's kind of a stupid question, but how do they sleep at night? You go home and you say these outrageous things, and then you have to kiss your kids and you tell them that you actually did something worthwhile in the world, but you just. I don't know. It's very confusing to me. People will trade almost all of their pride for a little bit of public regard. That's one thing I learned in journalism, is that there's no, that's an easy bargain for most folks. If you can, sell 1 million books by saying, Republicans are fascists, then you'll do it.
Right.
That's too bad, but it's true.
It's sad, the state of politics nowadays, and also in many ways reflecting some aspects of the state of these studies in academia. Things like this need to be a dialogue where people have respect, and it's quite funny to me. Most of what I study is things with the American and British left, particularly with the communist left. I think a lot of people would assume that in terms of the classroom, then that it would be a lot of leftist students taking my class and really enjoying them. Hands down, both to teaching at Central Michigan and at Saginaw Valley, the majority of students who come to my class on a regular basis and call me their favorite prof are my most conservative students, because they're conservatives who are open to a dialogue, who are fascinated in learning about this period of history. Even if they don't like the people that they're learning about, they're fascinated by it, and I'm open and respectful to their ideas, and we keep a dialogue open. And it's absolutely fantastic. I think I've had a great experience of advancing my own research in terms of my understanding of ways of bringing some of this research into the classroom. And most of the people who have been supportive have been my conservative students. They're fascinated a whole lot by my research here. So
I've written the same thing myself, and I don't know what to think about it. I think we should but anyway, on New Books in History, we're all about open dialogue and intelligent conversation. So that's good. Well, anyway, Joel Lewis, thank you very much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Marshall.
And stay in touch, okay?
Yep, you take care.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.
You've been listening to an interview with Joel Lewis about his new book, Youth Against Fascism, Young Communists in Britain and the United States, 1919 to 1939. I'm Marshall Poe, the host of New Books in History, and I hope you have a great week. Oh, and don't forget to become a fan of New Books in History on Facebook. Thanks a lot.
not the end of the world. Feels it ought to be.